In the year 541 AD, the Roman Empire was on the verge of a comeback. It had been nearly a century since the western half of the empire had collapsed, since the last Roman emperor in the west had been deposed in 476 AD and the Germanic kingdoms had divided up what had been the most powerful state in the Western world. But the eastern half of the empire, centered in Constantinople, had survived. And now, under the Emperor Justinian I, it was doing more than surviving. It was reconquering. Justinian's general Belisarius had retaken North Africa from the Vandals in 533 AD. He was in the middle of a campaign to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths. Spain seemed within reach. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it looked as though the Roman Empire might actually be restored, that the catastrophe of the 5th century might be reversed, and the ancient world might have a second chance. And then, in the spring of 541 AD, a ship docked at the Egyptian port of Pelusium. Among its cargo was something that no one could see, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The same bacterium that, 800 years later, would kill a third of Europe in what history would call the Black Death. This first outbreak, which historians call the Plague of Justinian, would kill somewhere between 25 and 50 million people over the next 2 centuries. It would end Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire. It would weaken the Byzantine state so severely that it could not resist the Arab conquests of the 7th century. And it would help set the conditions for what we now call the Dark Ages. It was, in the most literal sense possible, a turning point in the history of the world, caused by a microscopic organism that no one at the time could see, understand, or stop. To understand the stakes of what the plague destroyed, you need to understand what Justinian was actually trying to do. Justinian I is one of the most extraordinary figures in world history, a man of peasant origins who rose to become emperor of the most powerful state in the world and spent his entire reign attempting to restore the glory of ancient Rome. He was, depending on your perspective, either a visionary genius or a megalomaniac who bankrupted his empire chasing an impossible dream. Probably both. Under Justinian, Constantinople became the most magnificent city in the world. He rebuilt the Hagia Sophia, the great church that still stands in Istanbul today, after riots destroyed its predecessor. It was, for 1,000 years, the largest enclosed space on earth. His legal scholars compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, the comprehensive codification of Roman law that forms the basis of most European legal systems to this day. His generals reconquered North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain. At its peak, the Byzantine Empire under Justinian controlled more territory than it had in 2 centuries. It seemed genuinely possible that the Western Roman Empire could be restored. The cost was enormous in money, in lives, in the resentment of the peoples being reconquered. Italy in particular was devastated by the 20-year Gothic War, its population reduced and its agricultural systems disrupted. But Justinian pressed on, driven by what his court historian Procopius described as an almost supernatural ambition. And then the plague arrived. Procopius, who was present when it reached Constantinople in 542 AD, left one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of a pandemic in all of ancient literature. What he described would be familiar to anyone who lived through a modern epidemic and deeply alien in ways that remind you just how different the ancient world was. Procopius describes the plague arriving in Constantinople with terrifying speed. In a city of perhaps 500,000 people, it was soon killing 5,000 a day. Then 10,000 a day. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Rooftops were used as makeshift morgues. Mass graves were dug. Ships were loaded with corpses and sunk offshore. Justinian himself caught the disease and survived, one of the lucky minority who did. The plague spread outward from Constantinople along trade routes, reaching every part of the known world. It swept through the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. It followed soldiers on campaign and merchants on trade routes. It did not discriminate between rich and poor, powerful and weak. In some cities, it killed half the population. In the countryside, entire villages were abandoned. Procopius describes fields of grain left unharvested because there was no one to bring in the crops. Cattle wandering without owners. Villages entirely silent. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Tax revenues collapsed as the population died. Justinian's military campaigns, already stretched thin, became impossible to sustain. The reconquest of Italy ground to a halt. The campaign that had seemed so close to completion would drag on for another decade, devastating the peninsula and exhausting the empire. The Gothic War, which might have ended in 540 AD with a Byzantine victory, would not end until 554, and by then, Italy had been so comprehensively destroyed that the Roman restoration Justinian had dreamed of was more fantasy than reality. The cities of the Italian peninsula, already damaged by the war, were struck by plague so severely that some would not recover for centuries. Rome itself, the Eternal City, had a population of perhaps 30,000 by the late 6th century, down from 1 million at the empire's peak. The long-term consequences of the plague of Justinian are still debated by historians, but the broad outlines are clear. The plague did not kill the Byzantine Empire, but it weakened it so severely that the empire that survived was fundamentally different from the one Justinian had ruled. The tax base shrank as the population fell. The army shrank. The great building programs of Justinian's reign could not be continued by his successors. The western territories that Justinian had reconquered, North Africa, Italy, Spain, could not be held. The Visigoths retook Spain within decades. The Lombards invaded Italy in 568 AD, just 14 years after the end of the Gothic War, and carved out a kingdom in the north that the Byzantines could never dislodge. The greatest consequence, however, came in the 7th century. When the Arab armies burst out of Arabia in the 630s, energized by the new religion of Islam and united under a single political authority for the first time in history, they encountered a Byzantine Empire that had been weakened by a century of recurring plague. The great provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, the richest and most populous parts of the empire, fell to the Arab conquerors within a decade. The Sassanid Persian Empire, equally weakened by plague and by a devastating war with Byzantium, collapsed entirely. In the space of a generation, the political map of the known world was transformed, and historians have argued that the plague was a necessary precondition for this transformation. A Byzantine Empire at full strength might have been able to repel the Arab advance. The weakened empire of the mid-7th century could not. The plague of Justinian raises a question that historians have wrestled with for decades: how much do pandemics actually change history? It is tempting to see the plague as the cause of the early medieval period, the reason the Roman restoration failed, the reason the Arab conquest succeeded, the reason Europe entered what used to be called the Dark Ages. But history is never that simple. The Roman Empire was already under enormous stress before the plague arrived. Justinian's wars had been enormously expensive. The religious conflicts that divided his empire, the bitter theological disputes between different Christian factions, would have continued regardless of the plague. The Arab conquests were driven by a powerful new religious ideology that would have been formidable even against a healthy Byzantine Empire. The plague accelerated tendencies that were already present. It pushed fragile systems over the edge that were already leaning. What it reveals, more than anything else, is the profound vulnerability of complex, interconnected societies to biological threats. The Byzantine Empire was, in many ways, the most sophisticated political entity in the Western world. Its trade networks, its administrative systems, its military capacity, its legal and cultural institutions all were the product of centuries of development. And a bacterium that no one could see, carried by fleas on rats transported in the holds of merchant ships, was enough to bring it to its knees. We know Yersinia pestis intimately today. We have antibiotics that can kill it. We have surveillance systems that can track it. We have international agreements for containing outbreaks. We are, in every measurable way, better prepared for it than Justinian was. But the lesson of the plague of Justinian is not reassuring. It is a reminder that history's great turning points are not always announced by trumpets and armies. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the hold of a ship, invisible and unstoppable, while everyone is busy watching something else.